I feel younger every time I come to Israel. I don't know if it's the amazing talent and the young companies coming up. I don't know if it's the food, shakshuka, absolutely love it. Or I don't know if it's the minerals from Dead Sea, or maybe all of the above, right? So happy to be here. I always learn something new when I come to Israel. Tel Aviv is a hub of all the things that David mentioned in terms of the talent, in terms of technology, in terms of the things that we are doing, and all of this goes into what we are trying to build, right? So my name is Nitin Gaur. I serve as Director of Blockchain Labs. And if you look at the title of the presentation, I'm not going to paint the vision of what blockchain is. I'm not going to talk about the possibilities and the promise of technology, because we've been doing that for some time. We've been talking about blockchain. We compared that to internet. And I have been working at this heads down for almost 3 years, which is when we began the conversation around blockchain for the enterprise, right? So we had Bitcoins, we talked about that for some time, but then we begin to take these constructs and figuring out as to what are we trying to do with blockchain, right? We're trying to solve the issue of time and trust. And these two constructs lend themselves to many of the challenges that we see on a daily basis. So I have, again, personally engaged with over 400 clients heads down and figuring out that, look, last year alone, the industry did about 400 plus POCs. And when we do POCs, it's good to experiment, it's good to make press releases, but for us to do something meaningful, we have to go production to actually feel the pain of what it goes, to fulfill the promise of blockchain, to be able to remove some of the elements of time and trust that we talk about, and the cost that's associated with it. And the Fintech Agenda, which is going towards every aspect of the friction in financial services. So I think David also mentioned it's not a zero-sum game. So part of my team's role is to do solution verification, solution validation, look at the pragmatic elements of blockchain, and I'm here, I stand before you, younger me stands before you, to talk about, basically share that experience and knowledge that we've gained over time. Of course, I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to compress all that knowledge in about 20 minutes from that perspective. So we talk about a few things where we want to evaluate a few things, if you look at the things that we have solved for clients, I said we're not doing POCs anymore. We want to be able to find clients who are doing something real with it. So me and my team put heads down. We actually have about 10 networks in production globally, which is pretty impressive, and I have scars to prove it. And if you look at some of the learnings we've gone through that, it is not an easy task, right? We have to understand the technical elements. We have to understand the business elements. We have to understand how we marry the two together. How do we marry the business models that are evolving and yet build a network that's sustainable, right? So I'm here to impart that learning as we go in talking about that. So we look at a few things. We look at a few things around evaluating consensus models. And this is not a religious debate between, say, Hyperledger or Ethereum or many of the few hundred blockchain frameworks that are evolving. But we look at what are the pragmatic elements of consensus. Consensus is the heart of blockchain. It is the trust system that we're trying to build, which leads to some of the business model that is evolving on blockchain. We look at elements around control and governance. And I think if you look at the notion of decentralized application, it leads to self-governing. So if you look at, again, what Bitcoin has led or what many of the cryptocurrency elements have led, it leads to our self-governing models. But the world that we're trying to build, whether it's private equities, whether it's securities, whether it's lending, many of these, or syndicated loans, many of these use cases lead to a more regulated marketplace where we are trying to define the elements of how do we control and what are the governance models that are behind it. And these have implications, the choices that we make. This is another important one. We talk about digital asset creation. This is basically marrying the digital asset that's in the blockchain world to the physical world, whether we are trying to address the problem of tokenizing a particular asset, and who has the real authority to be able to generate that digital asset that moves through the blockchain system. Now, oftentimes, you'll see a POC or you'll see a demo, and you'll talk about, look, here's a token that moves from point A to point B, and ergo, this should work. Well, it's not really that simple, because we do have to understand some of the elements of governance, elements of the way we create the digital asset, because these digital assets are of things of value. At the end of the day, we are building a network of value, which means you have challenges around accountability, you have challenges around who really owns that asset, and you have a recourse that has to be addressed in a blockchain network. Authority of issuance. Who really has the power of issuing a digital asset in this world? So as we are defining the network, which can grow or shrink over time, which is an organic entity, who really has the authority to be able to define and create that particular digital asset, right? So we're trying to address some of these considerations, and before we design and jump into the technical aspects of it, I think these are some of the design elements that we want to look into, and of course, security. This is where I find this region enormously attractive, because a lot of technology that is evolving from here is utilized as components in what we're trying to build as a network. Now, one thing you realize, that most of the blockchain-specific stuff will be domain-specific, right? Every network that you create will have domain language, only because you'll find that in many cases, the consensus consortium, which is basically a group of companies doing business together, and like-minded people will come together to perform business, which means you'll never have a mortgage or a security in the same network. And that is a brief distinction that you have to understand, that as we are building network, it is centered around a business. Business networks exist today. They have friction. And we are trying to devise a model where these business networks are formed, and they're able to communicate and do business together. Right? And in most cases, we use the word smart contract very loosely, right? Smart contracts are not magic, but essentially smart contracts act as a glue and define, as a model to define your business rules. They are acting as a proxy in this digital network or digital transaction network that we're creating. So remember this, that these also have to be organic, right? Business models change, business assets change, new products evolve. So this notion of the definition of what we're defining as a business has to exist. Shared definition of asset types, right? Which means that industries today have, again, industries exist. Each industry has a data model. Each industry has a certain business language that we have to adhere to. Now, when we define the blockchain-based business network, we have to impart some of that advantages of blockchain network and borrow from the existing data formats and existing sort of business elements that are there, the shared definition of the language that the business speak. And that's why I think that you cannot have multiple asset types or diverse asset types in the same blockchain network. So you may have a mortgage network, you may have a securities network, you may have a private equity network. So these networks will exist, and there may be a chance for them to overlap and intermingle, but there'll never be a chance that you will have all these multiple asset types, only because of the challenges around governance, challenges around regulation, challenges around all the business function that the entity has to go through. So in many cases, regulation is an important part. As we are working with blockchain network, and this is a Fintech agenda, as Fintech decides to challenge every aspect of the financial services industry, we still believe that in many cases, you have to work under the framework of a regulatory body, right? So all the regulatory framework that exists, we have to do business in those. David also mentioned in the previous presentation that it's not a zero-sum game. So Fintech, who is trying to disrupt this industry, and you have the big banks who are trying to understand the disruption, eventually there's a convergence model where we are trying to figure out what is the shared regulatory burden. Because if we are trying and aspiring to create that network, there has to be a business advantage. We talk about shared KYC, shared AML, which, for example, collectively is about 25% of any bank's operating budget. So how do we take advantage of not just doing business on the network, but taking advantage of the shared elements of the business network that can suffice the regulatory requirements? And then I think, if you look at, again, from a domain-specific stuff, most businesses have functions. We do analytics, we do business intelligence. We apply a lot of technologies because managers and the business as a whole can make better decisions. And that's why I think that when we look at, as we're building it, and I'm happy to share some of the experiences and knowledge that we've gone, is that everything is domain-specific, only because the business function has to adopt and coexist with existing models, right? So those are a few things that I think is takeaway that we've implemented in some of the networks that we go around. Now, if there's one slide I want you to take with you, is this one. Right, these are the 7 principles. Now, you can ask me why 7. Well, 7 is a good number. It's catchy, so I just put 7. Of course, there are a lot more behind this. But these 7 to me, were fundamental models that has really worked well. So as you're defining a network, which is going above and beyond POC phase, we look at, how do we create sustainability? I'll give you an example, blockchain being what it is. You realize that today you can start a network, but if tomorrow your cost of processing a transaction is exponentially high, then it imposes a problem for the business to grow. Today, in most cases, if you look at the example of Visa, MasterCard, or any financial transactions, you have a cost per transaction. And based on that cost of transactions, you have a model that business can take on more transaction, which means business can grow. Now, if that cost model changes, then the business has to be prepared for it. So if the cost model today is a few cents to a transaction, and it goes to $6 to a transaction, then that has a fundamental challenge in the business growth, right? So in 6 years from now, for example, and we've seen that with Bitcoin-like networks, is that if it costs today, it costs me about $6 to process a transaction on the Bitcoin network. Apply that knowledge into what we are building today for our clients. $6 transaction is a deal breaker. You cannot really sustain your network with that kind of cost models around it. So how do we sort of look at efficiency and trade that for efficacy of a system where we are applying technology and cost and investment into these things to build a model that's sustainable over long run? Because it's not like after 5 years you say, I've tried this, it didn't work, let me go back to my old system, right? So in many cases, the first principle, participants should have control on the business. Now, each of these principles have technical underpinnings underneath it, right? Which means that entities who are joining the network, it still relies on the principles of decentralized networks. So entities can join the network, and they can leave the network. They should have control of the business where businesses change, their business models change, their requirements change. How do I implement that in a business network? Because today, many of the elements of smart contracts, which is nothing but a contractual agreement between multiple entities, is very static in nature. So how do we give business a control around it? So that's the first principle, that when we design a network, it should be open and it should be available for the business to be having control on their business. Second thing is it must be extensible with membership flexibility. So the second line, again, is the fact that what do you do when a business wants to join the network? What do you do when a business leaves the network, right? Which means you're giving them not just the control, but ensuring that the business model the network is built upon is capable of handling the addition of new members or leaving of some of the members. Must be permission. Now, this is the debate we oftentimes have between permission network or a non-permission network. Non-permission networks like cryptocurrency networks. But in permission network, the reason why it's permission because you have a certain sense of governance, a certain set of onboarding mechanism of the entities or the businesses who are joining the network to solve the business problem. So in many cases, in a permission network, while you still want to be open, while you still want to be able to conduct business, you have to ensure that you're protecting the data not just for regulatory perspective, but also for competitive advantage. So how do I transact with you and yet not let you see all the information because blockchain is linked chain and has a provenance of all the data behind it. So this is another principle which I think is important. And the fourth one, which to me is the most important part. So the first four are business principles and the remaining are technical principles. The first four are, the fourth one is it must allow open access and global collaboration. Now this to me is important because businesses change, business model change, products change. So how do you make sure the network is flexible enough for you to adopt to those changes? So if, for instance, if tomorrow I have an offering of a certain percentage point for a syndicated loan, I want to change that value proposition or introduce a new product, is your blockchain network capable of handling that change and the dynamicity that the network has to adopt to? Next thing is, fifth one is must be scalable for network processing and data encryption processing. So if you look at blockchain technology in general, there are four basic components. You have shared data, you have business logic, you have encryption, and you have consensus, which collectively forms what we call as blockchain. Now, these four technically are very intensive, process-intensive tech, which means that you're expending a lot of time and technology in doing it. So how do we make sure that as the network grows, we are making the same commitments to our clients in terms of transaction processing, we're making the same commitment, and yet we're having a cost that's predictable? I touched upon that early on. Second thing is must be secure and address new security challenges. This is, again, the stuff that I learned here last time when I was here, talked about zero-knowledge proof. Some of these technologies that are emerging is aimed to address some of the new challenges around it. Remember, we are building a trust network, which means the network itself has to be secure, resilient, and trustworthy. So what technical choices do I make to ensure not just the security of data and the participants, which is privacy and confidentiality, but also security of the transactions themselves? And the last but not the least is it must coexist with existing systems. This is a huge, huge problem around this, right? Which means that you have systems that coexist. You have treasury systems, you have analytics, you have business models. Now, if you're trying to replace a transaction system with blockchain to take advantage of the promise of blockchain, they still have to coexist and talk to these existing systems, which in my opinion is a huge enterprise challenge for us to address. And an opportunity for the entrepreneurs in the room is, I think, that as we are changing the world, the old and new has to coexist while we are trying to develop and evolve this new transaction system based on blockchain. So these 7 principles, and by the way, I have a paper I've written on each one of those principles. Happy to share that with you at some point. But the point is that when we're looking and devising a more pragmatic approach which goes above and beyond POCs to make something real, we have to have technology, we have to have talent, we have to have thinking behind how we evolve, develop, and model these networks. Because these design principles will let your network grow, make it sustainable, cost-effective, and go towards some more efficient technical models around it. Then we look at, for example, considering extensibility design. How do we, so when I'm telling you, you're saying, Nitin, you told me all these cool stuff. How do I implement it? What are the choices do I make? So in many cases, we design for flexibility of membership. Entities can join, you get a certain set of keys in a network that lets you, which means that the compute power required for permission network is a lot less because now you're a permissioned entity around it, right? So flexibility of who you are, identifying the entity and its participants who are submitting transactions is an important one. Compute equity, remember this part, it's a network, which means just like Bitcoin network, mining is what governs your stake in the network. But in a permission network, we have to devise what's a compute equity. Who brings what to the table so we can sustain the network and overall ensure the processing timeframes of the networks are in line with the SLAs that we have made to our clients. So in many cases, we look at, and again, we have various business models around this, where we talk about the compute equity considerations as to what are the models and who gets penalized if you don't bring the right amount of compute equity to the table. Shared business interests, again, these are domain-specific. We look at having a shared business, whether it's a shared KYC, shared data, or having an entity that manages some of the back office function that individually all the entities manage today, right? So again, we've seen use cases, especially syndicated loans, securities lending type use cases. Private equity, I recently spent 8 months of my life with my team designing the private equity, the first private equity marketplace for Northern Trust. And I'll tell you, it was an amazing experience where we realized the pain points and the cost points around it, which means that as we are getting the asset management companies, as we're getting the custody banks of the network, and the various ecosystem players who provide certain services, what does it take? What does it take for me to be able to bring these entities to the table and keep it extensible enough that, yes, I'm permissioning, but I still don't have to wait for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months in some cases to join the network. And then governance. There has to be some entity that upkeeps and has the health of the network in mind, and as well as the business rules that we have to engage with. Now, we look at some of these technical elements around this to ensure that what are the choices that we have to make. We look at network and technology, we look at data formats, the amount of data that I'm replicating. And all the choices we make in any of ththese points I'm talking about has a direct implication on the investment that you make in technology. So the cost of the network that we're building has direct, and I'll give you another example. Working with a client, and the assumption that, look, blockchain looks easy because the demos are really easy, and you can move the asset really fast, so why don't we go and build a network? We did the analysis, and we realized the network would cost about 100 million to build. This is the first-time investment into the network. Now, that's not a small change, but depending on what use case you're solving for, 100 million may be too much or too little, right? So we have to realize that the choices that we make in any of this, you have to have sustainable network, you have to have the right set of technologies, and resiliency built in the network, because you are doing business. It is a transaction network of sorts. So we look at this smart contracts, transaction management, and all the choices we make here is available to us from the smorgasbord of the technical elements that are available in blockchain technology as a whole. So with that, how am I doing on time? Oh, that's perfect timing then. It's a plug-in for my next session. I'm going to have a session on blockchain where I'm going to take this part and say, fine, I've laid out the 7 principles for you. I've talked about some of the experiences, some of the learnings that we have done. I'm going to talk about a methodology that we employ in IBM to be able to bring the pragmatic elements of taking a use case and taking it to market and helping clients understand this, because I have many use cases that we've gone through the phase of the prototype, but we are now stuck at the point that you have to have a strong business model around it. So we have the tech, we have the acumen, we have the people. It's now just a matter of finding the right business model, right use case for us to implement. With that, I'll give it back to you. Thank you for your time and attention.